This conference will now be recorded.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Hooved Animal Humane Society's First Time for Goat Owners What to Expect seminar. Our presenter today is Dr. Emma Kamps. She is a Woodstock native who graduated from the University of Illinois College of Veterinary Medicine in 2020 after completing her undergraduate degree at Wittenberg University in Springfield, Ohio, where she was involved in vocal music and improv comedy. Dr. Emma spent her first year out in general practice in southern Wisconsin and now practices at the Animal Hospital of Woodstock, where her professional interests include soft tissue surgery, ultrasound, and canine reproduction. Dr. Emma has bred and shown dairy goats across the Midwest for the past 15 years and does see select farm animal patients. Client education is one of Dr. Emma's passions, so she is very excited we invited her to talk about her favorite topic today, goats. Welcome, Dr. Emma. Just a quick reminder to everyone to please mute your microphones and to put your questions in the chat. We will answer those at the end of the presentation. Let's get this over to Dr. Emma.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to talk on this topic. And then as a disclosure, I am doing this presentation from the clinic today. So you might hear some animal sounds in the background, but I think it just adds to the ambiance of the whole thing. So I'm not too bothered by it. Okay. So we're going to get started, and I'm just going to preface with, we're going to talk a little about a lot. So there's certainly more depth to be kind of explored on all of these topics, but I'm just trying to stay brief and hit as many things as possible just to kind of give a breadth of knowledge. And I'm going to have my email at the end too. So if there's any questions or any follow-up that you would like, you're free to reach me there and kind of pick my brain. And I'm never going to turn down the opportunity to talk about my favorite animal. So something that's important is establishing some type of rapport with your audience. So here's proof in picture that I did graduate. So I got my bachelor's from Wittenberg University in 2016 in biology and music. I then went to the University of Illinois, ILL, INI, and then I have 15 years of experience breeding and showing goats. So that kind of gives me a little bit of leverage. But honestly, if you ask anyone, my family included, I've loved these animals since I was little. So going even further back than 15 years, these friendly little lovable creatures have always been my favorite. So like I said, we're going to talk about a variety of different topics today. So we're going to start out with some goat history, get into the rising popularity of goats right now, some common terminology, and I hope by the end of this session, no one will be calling them billy goats and nanny goats anymore, because we've got some better words than that. Going into housing and keeping these creatures, how to enrich their environment. We're going to spend a lot of time on healthcare and some common kind of conditions that we see that they can present as, and then kind of ending our presentation on senior goat care and end-of-life planning, because, you know, as much as we try and put off these things, eventually our beloved pets and companions do reach the end of their life, so we need to be able to prepare for those kinds of things. So interestingly, goats are the oldest domestic species. So there's history and architecture and fossils and art that go back 10,000 years that have goats in them. And I think that just kind of speaks to just how versatile and how tough these animals are. So there are over 300 different breeds that are possible, and I think they all developed in different areas, so they all look very different and they have different strengths, and that's just because they've been selectively bred to be able to survive in these environments that are so different. So as far as historical significance goes, We have our Greek god Pan over here, who is represented by having the top half of a man and the bottom half of a goat. He also makes an appearance in Hercules and is one of my favorite characters in that movie. In Norse folklore, I know it's not included in the Avengers movies, but Thor actually has a chariot that's pulled by goats. And then if any of our viewers are in tune with their Chinese zodiac, they'll know that the goat is also on the calendar, and those individuals are represented as being peace-loving, kind, and popular people. So goats can be found all over across the world and in all aspects of history, and I think that's pretty cool. Speaking of current history here, goats are everywhere. And when we looked at data from the USDA and the American Dairy Goat Association, from 2007 to 2017, goat ownership and new registries were up 40% in the last 15 years. That is crazy. So I think a lot of it is because there's been a push for urban farming and homesteading. And I think that also has to do with social media and, getting out there that these people are able to have these urban homesteads and things like that. They're popular in the media. Everyone remembers the screaming goat videos from a couple of years ago to Taylor Swift songs. On TikTok, there's so many creators that share their goats on there. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that they're accessible farm animals. So, cows are massive creatures and they have to be housed in oftentimes massive facilities. A lot of times large animals are intimidating for people that don't have a lot of experience with farm animals, and goats are a lot more approachable. And then looking at these images over here, I was shocked to find out that in the last month, there were commercials that had goats in them almost 250,000 times. And I personally love the Super Bowl commercials, so it's always a hit for me to see a goat in those. And then numerous articles about why goats are fantastic and easy pets. And if you're local, hey, I just found 3 places for you to do some goat yoga right in the Chicagoland area. And no kidding, they all almost have 5 stars because goats are the best. So I think there are ample opportunities both online through social media platforms and in person to be able to be exposed to these awesome animals. So goats are super versatile. So as far as dairy goats go, there are a number of different dairy products that we can make from them. Milk, yogurt, and kefir are 3. You can find them on small, family-owned farms. Even in the aisles of Walmart, Aldi is really good about having goat products there too to try out. Personal care products. I know here in Woodstock, there are a couple shops right on the square that sell goat milk soap and goat milk lotion. A lot of times these can be very soothing for the skin and a lot more gentle than other harsh products. So I know quite a few friends with children that have sensitive skin that opt for these products instead of others. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention meat production, because in other parts of the world, goats are truly the sole source of meat, and it's a very lean, healthy option. We're not going to spend too much time talking about that, but I do need to mention it. There are some types of goats that are bred just like sheep, so for their cashmere, very expensive wool to make clothing and different art pieces and things like that. And then pack animals. So I know this is more popular out west where there are more mountains, but there are some people that will put packs and backpacks on their animals and take them hiking and camping with them. And because they're such amazing athletes and they have incredible balance, they're wonderful resources to have for that. Also out west, there's a lot of wildfires that happen, and these animals can be employed to clear areas of roughage that could otherwise catch on fire. They are browsers by nature, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So they will clean up bushes and weeds and trees and other things that grazers like cows and sheep won't touch. And because they are athletes, they can get into places and clear brush that machinery isn't able to reach as well. And then the last reason that people decide to own these wonderful animals is for companionship. They're quirky little animals. They have their little idiosyncrasies, but they are friendly, they are interactive, and gosh darn it, I say pretty cute. So in sum, one of my favorite statements from one of my least favorite professors in vet school, who was more of a swine vet, truly did not like goats at all, but he said that goats will save the world because they are so versatile. They can thrive in environments that are arid, that have very sparse vegetation. Their energy needs are less than cattle. They're smaller, so they don't have to eat as much, and they can be kept in smaller plots. The reproductive cycle is much shorter, so you can potentially breed twice a year for these guys if you push them. If goats were the same size as cows, they would produce more milk pound for pound than cows would. And they're so diverse. Like we said, they're used for pack animals, they can be used for fiber, they can be used for meat. So goats truly are the goat, the greatest of all time when it comes to versatility in farm animals. So some terminology to get started with, and the image on the right is used a lot in showmanship classes for goat showing. Children are quizzed on body parts of the animal, and it's not just a torturous ritual we put them through, but these are important things to know, especially if you're having a conversation with your veterinarian. If you can describe what's going on with correct verbiage, that's going to help me diagnose things and decide what could potentially be going on. So I'm not going to go over all of these body parts. This image is found online, so if you wanted to look into it, there's a resource online. The American Dairy Goat Association has a handbook that has their anatomy and body parts on there as well, but just general knowledge to have as far as when you're talking about what parts. An intact male goat is considered a buck. Historically and colloquially, that's a billy goat. Intact females are does, so just like deer. A neutered male goat is a wether. Notice the spelling, not the weather forecaster, and not whether or not, it's its own spelling. A group of goats is often referred to as a herd, but if you Google it, the official word for a group of goats is called a trip of goats, which I guess that is what it means when you let the little goats out and they're running around you and you get knocked over. A lot of tripping that happens. So young goats are called kids. There are some goats that are naturally born without horns, and those animals are considered polled. When we're talking about animals that deliver kids and come into milk and start producing milk, they freshen with milk, and then to deliver the kids is considered kidding. So there are over 300 recognized breeds. Some of them are very unique to the types of areas that they're from. I'm not going to include pictures of 300 breeds on here, just a select few. So on the left, we've got some examples of dairy goats. There are some that are recognized by the Dairy Goat Association that are not in this picture. In the center, these two cute little fuzzballs are pygmy goats. So these are miniature-sized goats. They will not get to standard size, and they look like little beer kegs on legs. They're chubby little things. Over on the right, we've got a boar goat, which is traditionally bred for meat. This is a very large boar goat. They're not all this big. Fainting goats, or myotonic goats, are a breed that has an issue with muscle conduction when they get scared. They overproduce an enzyme that locks up their legs. It's only a temporary condition. It does not hurt them at all, but it's really funny to watch. We've also got some horns, they are horns. We've got some goats from over in the Middle East that have some impressive horns that don't grow straight back like other animals. They can grow up and curve. And then I'm sure everyone's kind of seen these weird goats. I don't know what I would do if I was faced with one, honestly. But my favorite goats are my own goats. So here are some kids that I had born in March of this year. And I think they look like they should be on the cover of some like 90s boy band or something like that in this picture. So as far as goat registries goes, if you go on Craigslist, there are numerous ads for animals that are being sold. Some of those are from breeders that don't do registries, some are. I will encourage you, if you are interested, to look at the websites for the goat registries because they've usually got a lot of information pages on there about goat uses, about meetings and clubs and shows and ways to get involved. And there's oftentimes directories on there too. So if you're looking for local resources and local people to kind of pick their brain about these animals, that's a wonderful place to start. So the American Dairy Goat Association is the largest association for milking animals currently. There's the Boer Goat Association, which is breed specific. There's a miniature dairy goat association because if goats are this good in standard size, they must be even better fun size. The American Goat Society is another organization here as well. And then there's the Cashmere Goat Association as well. And I will say this is only a selection of registries in the United States. So there is something for everyone. I know there's a Pygmy Goat Association that I didn't include a picture of, but for every different flavor, there's an option. And then here's my little plug for county fairs and 4-H support. So a great way to get exposed to these animals and to see them in person is to go to your local county fair. So a lot of times they have livestock in all areas. So cattle, swine, poultry, goats, sheep, and there are 4-Hers abound that are ready to talk to you about their animals and educate you about their animals. So I have included a list of some of the local county fairs. Kane County Fair is coming up here shortly in the Chicagoland area, and the ones in red are ones that I will be attending with my animals too. So if you want to come out and say hi to my wonderful perfect goats, then you are more than welcome to swing by the goat barn and say hi. But otherwise, it's a very accepting community, and one of the main reasons that we show and exhibit our animals at fairs is so we can educate and talk to people. So that's a great place to build connections locally. As far as housing goes, goats can be difficult to contain, and this is speaking as the owner of a goat velociraptor hybrid that has escaped almost every single fence we've put her in this year. So some considerations are definitely ventilation. So it's better to have more windows than not because ammonia can build up in the bedding from their urine. And when they sleep, their nose is awfully close to the ground. So inhaling this ammonia can inhaling ammonia predisposes to pneumonia. We need some type of wind blocking or some way to escape the sun, especially if you live in farmland and there's not a lot of trees to help you out. As far as secure fencing goes, there are some people that insist, oh my gosh, you have to have specific goat fencing. The holes cannot be any wider than 2 inches, otherwise they will squeeze through them. I promise you, goats are not liquids. A cattle panel, a 6-foot cattle panel will work just fine. Chain link will work just fine. But a consideration is if you have goats with horns, they can get their horns stuck in the fence, and there's a really big artery that runs in the middle of the horn. So that can be an emergent situation if they're able to get their horns in the fence and snap it off. They need dry bedding, so making sure that you know which way the water runs when it rains and floods. And then, yes, goats are escape artists, and sometimes it takes an amendment or 2 or 3 to be able to keep them in the pen, but I promise they haven't figured out how to fly yet. Another issue with housing and goat keeping is hay wastage. These guys will waste hay, and there is no way to get around it. So feeders such as this black one that they have to stick their heads through the fence to reach the hay are best. Otherwise, they will grab a mouthful, turn their head, and dump it all over the floor. So you don't necessarily need this beautiful open concept barn up on the top here to have good airflow. I know there are some barns that we just can't get windows, so I'll often have owners install a ceiling fan on top and just run it, because that causes a kind of column of air to go down, and that'll help lift up the ammonia from that bottom level and make it easier to breathe. And then for the summer, and if you have large enough groups housed together in the winter, things like this polydome or calf huts can be really great options too. And you can just move those houses every couple of weeks to make cleaning a little bit easier. This is an example of the type of fencing that I've had good success with keeping animals in. They'll stand on it, so they'll bend it, so that's another thing to kind of keep in mind, but it will contain them, I promise. All right, nutrition. Goats will eat anything, even a tin can. This is the most bold-faced lie I think I've ever heard about goats in my entire life, and I was fooled too, because you see on cartoons, you see in commercials, goats walking around with tin cans and bags and trash and garbage. Oh gosh, this couldn't be farther from the truth. So goats are very picky eaters. If any hay, if any grain, if any treat falls on the ground, they will not eat it because it is contaminated. So my general rule for minimizing wasting and keeping in mind that these are very picky animals is those head-in feeders. I was advised by a goat mentor of mine that the average pet goat only needs as much hay as they will clean up in 20 minutes. You know, there are some dairies that have food out in front of them 24/7. I guarantee you will end up with bales and bales on the ground. And if you're thinking about getting goats to help clean up hay after other animals you have, like horses, this is not the animal for you. They will not do that job. So another note is that excess grains, so like crackers and cookies and sweet peas, and very protein-rich foods like alfalfa can lead to obesity. And this is one of the biggest things we see in pet goats because they're cute and they love saltine crackers. So we just keep sticking them in front of their face like they're the ticket machine at Chuck E. Cheese, but they can get fat, and especially, you know, we have to be careful with male goats, and we'll touch on this later. This kind of diet, this high protein diet, can change the pH or the acidity of the urine, and this can predispose to bladder stones, which is a big problem. So only grass hay, as much as they can eat in 20 minutes for the average pet goat. Obviously, these nutritional needs change during pregnancy and lactation. Those animals need high protein food and forage and grain to help keep their weight up, because these animals can be dairy animals, and they will put all of their energy into producing milk. Some goat safe snacks, all in moderation, would be some veggies, carrots, broccoli, beans, and some fruits as well. And then a note on digestion. So a few of our viewers might be avid horse people, and I wanted to point out the biggest difference between goats and ruminants and horses is that goats are foregut fermenters, which means the majority of digestion and the fermentation of their food and the extraction of essential amino acids happens before their true stomach, versus in horses where it is the exact opposite. So their food goes directly into their stomach, passes through the small intestines, and their colon is the largest part diameter-wise of their GI tract. And this can kind of explain why colonic torsions and other things like this are such a big source of colic in horses, and not necessarily for goats, just because their anatomy is a little bit different. So goats and ruminants like cows do not have 4 stomachs. They have 1 stomach with 4 chambers. The rumen is the biggest portion, and it's located on the left side. When you're looking at them, it's their left side. It's a giant mixing vat. So all of their food comes in, and as their rumen contracts and moves around, it stores everything up, so it's in the acid of the stomach. The reticulum and omasum, which are the next 2 steps in the GI tract, have immense surface area to try and save and conserve water. And the abomasum is the true stomach, so that is most similar to our stomachs that excrete acid and have a lot of glands in them too. So there are 3 steps to digestion for these guys. Rumination, which is the mixing of that big giant mixing vat of the rumen. Eructation, which is when they bring pieces up to chew their cud. So they'll primarily eat the forage, it'll ruminate a while, and then they'll spit it back up in their mouth and chew it again, because if it's good once, it's good twice. And then eventually, once it's been broken down into small enough fiber size, it'll get moved to the abomasum, the true stomach, and then the intestines behind it. Rumen health is systemic health. So keeping them on a forage diet, avoiding changes in feed are going to be super helpful for keeping these guys healthy, because they can get bloated, they can have acidosis where the pH of the fluid in the rumen changes, and stasis where nothing moves. So this is an example of what the tissue in the rumen and omasum actually looks like. So it's actually kind of beautiful when it's all cleaned off, but notice all of the folds and kind of wedges in there. That's all to protect the lining from the really fibrous material they eat and to help us out with water conservation. So goats they're such fun animals. They are social when they are socialized from being young. They are curious. And I think that's also why they're escape artists. You know, if there is a chain, if there is a gate, if there is a hook or a latch, they're going to play with it with their mouths like a toddler would play with their hands. They are social with people and social with their own kind as well. So they should be kept in groups. At minimum, you should always have 2 goats together. They have normal behaviors that they like to express, like climbing. So this is an example of a deluxe goat house. If you can get your hands on the giant pinwheels that they use for doing like electrical wiring and stuff like that, those are excellent things for them to jump and climb on. We can grab some giant broom heads or brushes, or if you're lucky enough to get the brush from like a street sweeper, those are awesome too. These guys will stand there for hours and scratch their head and fight with the brush that's on the wall. Goats are intelligent and they're highly food motivated. These are 2 traits that I also associate myself with, but they can be trained to do a lot of different tasks like agility, tricks. They can give paw, they can jump. I've even known of some goats to be potty trained. I had one kid that I sold that was a house goat that thought he was a German Shepherd, and he was trained by the German Shepherd to go potty outside, and it was a wonderful thing for that family. So basic health care and some information to know. Their lifespan is typically from 8 to 15 years. A lot of this depends on breed. A lot of this depends on size. So as a general rule, smaller animals live longer than bigger animals. Normal vital signs. If you wanted to take a screenshot of this page, I would do it. So I'm not training you to be a vet, but if you know what is normal, then you can know what is abnormal. So when we look at heart rate, it's higher in smaller animals. If it's elevated in adults, that could be due to fever or pain. Their respiration rate, so how many times they breathe, that is important to count not only the number, but to observe how they're breathing too. If they have a lot of excess effort, either on inspiration when they breathe in or expiration when they breathe out, that could be a sign of something like pneumonia or some other lung pathology that needs attention. Temperature is important too. It's also going to be higher in younger animals. And keep in mind how warm it is outside. So especially with this weather that we've been having that is super hot, that can cause internal temperatures to be higher, but still normal. So keep those in mind. And then like we kind of discussed before, the rumen is on the left side of the body. And if you watch and you put your hands on their side, you will feel the wave of their rumen contracting. So 1 to 2 contractions per minute is normal for these guys. And then a brief first aid kit and some information to have on hand. Please have a thermometer, and please make sure that thermometer works. Because I can't tell you how many people I've called about a sick animal, and I say, all right, what's their temperature? And they say, you know, doc, we have a thermometer. It's coated in a layer of dust. I don't think it works. So have a thermometer, label it goat thermometer, because I know we've had instances in my house where my sister has used the animal thermometer, and I have never told her that she used the animal thermometer because I think that would lead to quite an explosive conversation. So betadine is an antiseptic. You can find it over the counter, also triodine or something like that. When you're using it to wash wounds, dilute it to the color of weak tea. Otherwise, it can be kind of caustic on the tissues. Blood stop powder or quick stop is important for trimming feet. It happens to everyone. You trim a little bit too short, and then you have a little bit of a bleeding wound. Bandage material like Coflex or cast padding or something like that, if we have a superficial wound that needs wrapping. There are still antibiotics that are available for purchase over the counter. Of the options that we have, I think LA200, which is oxytetracycline, is one of the most diverse antibiotics that we can use. It's worth having on hand. Dewormers, and we'll talk about this. So ivermectin, which is a clear dewormer, versus Panacur, aka fenbendazole, which is a white dewormer. And then optional would be some type of pain control like Banamine, which comes in a topical that you pour on their back. It's not as well absorbed as it is for cattle, but it's an option. And meloxicam, which is an anti-inflammatory commonly used in small animal medicine. And then a note, and this goes for horses as well. If you have annual farm visits with a veterinarian to do herd health checks and have yearly conversations, you are more likely to get worked in for emergencies. And this is true for small animals, dogs, and cats as well. If our schedule is booked and we get a call from someone who's been a good client that is established, that we know is working with us and will take our advice and our recommendations, we will be more likely to work you in than someone that we've never seen before. And I apologize if that seems harsh, but in the world of having too little veterinarians to care for the amount of animals that we have and the massive retirement and kind of leaving that we have of veterinarians from the field due to mental health problems and other work-life balance problems, we are going to work with the people that put in the effort to work with us. So annual visits for all animals are definitely encouraged, because you will never have an emergency until you have an emergency, and then it's too late. So here is a list of common health problems for animals, and we will not talk about all of them. Gosh, that would be 5 lectures on its own. But we will touch on barber pole worm, which is one type of internal parasite, CL, caseous lymphadenitis, contagious eczema, aka sore mouth, CAE, ringworm, and urinary obstruction. And then this is my favorite little kid from this year, Adora, who is not the escape artist, but still managed to break her leg somehow early this spring. I'm happy to report she's out of her cast and she's walking normally, and it looks like everything healed up beautifully. She will be at the fair early next month if you want to come and say hi. This is my all-time least favorite thing ever. So, male goats that are fed an inappropriate diet are at risk of urinary obstruction, and this can absolutely be deadly. So anatomically, the diameter of their urinary tract, their urethra and their penis, is much smaller than the females. So that means that it's going to take a smaller stone or a smaller crystal plug to be able to plug that hole and stop urine from leaving. It's also a management problem. So when we talked about cereal grains and treats and fat goats, this is the end result, and it is always heartbreaking. So the prognosis or likelihood of recurrence and survival for a goat with stones or crystals is poor, and prevention is the best medicine. So animals that are straining to urinate, and I'll show a picture of the posture, animals that are dribbling urine or have blood in their urine, these are all signs and symptoms. Whenever I hear of a male goat that is sick, the first thing I ask is, when did you last see them urinate? Because this happens so often. Eventually, as they kind of progress in this condition, they'll go off feed, they won't eat, their abdomen will be bloated, and this could potentially be because their bladder is getting large or because their bladder has ruptured because there's so much urine backed up. As far as treatment options goes, the kind of cheapest and fastest thing that we can do is snip off this urethral process that they have on the tip of their penis. This is exceptionally narrow, and sometimes if we're lucky, a stone or some type of blockage is right at the base of that, and snipping this process can solve it. I will say the majority of times this does not help us out. We have some medications that we can give orally and into the bladder itself to dissolve these stones, but the problem is that takes time, and usually we don't know that they have stones or an issue until they're blocked, and then we have to do something else about it. The third option with the best prognosis is expensive and extensive surgery. So this is not surgery that I'm equipped to do at this hospital. We are talking transferring you to the University of Illinois or the University of Wisconsin-Madison for the specialists to do these surgeries to try and save them and give them an option to urinate. So this is a picture of a goat that's kind of parked out. He's got his back legs back and he's kind of bearing down, trying to urinate, but he can't. This is the anatomy problem that we have. So you might say, well, Dr. Emma, I had a cat that was urinary obstructed, and they just passed the urinary catheter into his bladder and relieved the obstruction, and he's fine on a special food. Why can't we do that with goats? And that's because of this thing called the sigmoid flexure right here. So see, it is shaped just like the letter S, this urethra is, and that's to allow for some type of shooting out motion when they breed. But because of these sharp curves in the urethra, we can't pass the urinary catheter up to flush back into the bladder, and it really limits our treatment options. So this is a picture on an anatomy specimen of the type of surgery that we would do. So we would go in, take the stones out of the bladder, and then place this catheter that drains urine around the urethra, giving the time for the urethral swelling to go down. And this apparatus is removed as soon as the animal can urinate on their own. But even going forward, a goat that is blocked once is at risk to block again, and you have to be very strict with management with these guys to avoid this in the future. I want to say the last animal that I referred for this procedure is between $2,000 to $4,000, including the hospital stay and drugs to go home and stuff like that. So if we're talking about a pet goat, you know, it can be really heartbreaking. And I have euthanized many animals for this condition, some as young as 3 months old. So getting them on an appropriate diet, even when they're young, is vitally important. And it's heartbreaking every time. I absolutely hate blocked goats. 2 infectious diseases that are very virulent and can cause problems are CAE and CL, especially in dairy goats. These are very common. So caprine arthritis and encephalitis virus and caseous lymphadenitis. If you're looking for new Scrabble words, here you go. So CAE has 2 main presentations of the disease, and they present in different age groups. So in kids and in young animals that are affected, we can see neurologic signs. This might present as changes in balance, changes in awareness. Sometimes these kids will just seem dull, and they will do head pressing behaviors. They'll go up to a wall and press their head against it. In adults, we tend to see swelling of joints. We can see weight loss. We can see animals drop in milk production. And colloquially, the change in texture of the udder is considered hard bag in adults. So the normal lactation tissue is very soft, and with CAE, it can become very firm and non-productive tissue, so their milk production goes down. So this is a disease that is passed through colostrum, which is the first milk, and regular milk too. So once you have it in your herd, if you're not pasteurizing or if you're not feeding some type of milk replacer, every kid that you feed that milk to has the potential to contract this disease. So it can spread like wildfire. There's a blood test that we can run to confirm the presence of this disease, and there are plenty of labs that we can send to. I've included at the end of the slide, I really like the Washington State Diagnostic Lab. They do a ton of work with small ruminants, so that is a verified lab that I trust. It's uncurable, but management-wise, these animals live relatively normal lives but we have to take into consideration the joint changes, especially with older animals. If we want to eliminate it from our herd, the best thing to do is to cull and potentially euthanize or sell those animals. Otherwise, pasteurizing the milk before you feed it to kids is going to protect those kids you have. CL presents as hard swellings and draining lesions. These abscesses form where lymph nodes are. So this has a predilection for lymphoid tissue. There are external and internal lymph nodes, and I'll show a picture of the external ones that we can see. The internal lymph nodes, if those become abscessed, can be even more challenging to diagnose because we can't see them. So just like we would think, it's spread through purulent material, purulent meaning pus, but you can't put pussy on a slide. So purulent material that drains from these abscesses. There's also a blood test to confirm this. I would also send it to Washington State. It is also uncurable, but there are some animals that once their active lesions are gone, they don't have recurrence. But every time you have an abscess that pops, you potentially have spread to other animals. So these are common spots for lymph nodes. And this is kind of general throughout species. So if you ever get a sore throat, that's your submandibular lymph node. Sometimes, after vaccines, your lymph node in your axillary region under your armpit can swell. In general, if you have a goat with an abscess, it'll kind of start small and haired, and as it gets more mature, it'll lose the hair over it. These abscesses can be lanced with a blade and drained of all that infectious material. And you can flush and spray those wounds with dilute betadine to keep it clean. And ideally, if you're trying to minimize spread, you're going to keep these goats away from the herd so that they're not exposed to that material. Other contagious conditions that I feel are worth mentioning would be sore mouth. So this is a pox virus, very similar to chickenpox in people. And that actually makes it zoonotic, which means that it's a disease that can be spread from people to animals and animals to people. So we see these crusting lesions that are usually more severe in young animals on their mouths, but especially in animals that are left to nurse on their moms, we can see these lesions on their udders as well. These lesions will go away with time, but you can quote unquote make a vaccine. It's actually pretty cool. If you take a needle or something and you make a nick in the skin of a healthy animal and rub the crust from the sore mouth in it, they will develop sore mouth in that lesion. But just like chickenpox in people, once you have it once, you don't have it again. So you can kind of control who is exposed and where they have these lesions. Ringworm is inappropriately named. It's not a worm at all. It's a fungal organism. It's self-limiting, which means it does go away on its own, but it might need treatment. I think this picture is actually a cow now that I look at it, but it still counts. So they can get circular crusting lesions, and ringworm is zoonotic, so it can be spread to people as well. Also, kittens love to get ringworm too. So if you ever have new young kittens that have crusting round lesions, it's probably a fungal disease, and you might want to check yourself for lesions too. Other kind of goat maintenance just to keep in mind is that their hooves grow depending on the animal and depending where they're housed. So they need to be trimmed with garden shears every 4 to 8 weeks. So you don't necessarily have to have the farrier out. Their hoof wall isn't as dense as horses, so you can usually trim them with just hand shears. Yearly vaccine is usually a tetanus vaccine. So across the street at Farm and Fleet, you can get the CDT vaccine. There are some vaccines that have different strains of tetanus and Clostridium in there. So Covaxin 8 protects against 8 versions. Calvary 9, which is my favorite, protects against 9 versions. Goats are extra sensitive to tetanus, so they need annual boosters. I also like to booster kids when they get dehorned or when they get castrated, because any open wound has the potential to let this organism in. I have some clients that vaccinate their goats for rabies, and I think it's a wise thing to do, but as far as legality of it goes, it is off-label. So if there is any question about whether or not the animal is rabid and they've gotten the vaccine, we don't count the vaccine as working. So that animal does need to be euthanized and sent for testing regardless of vaccine status. Fecal testing should be done annually, especially if you have an animal that's losing weight or appears pale. So we will kind of touch on this a little bit more. When animals are housed in close proximity, especially during the winter, it's not uncommon for them to have external parasites like lice. Thankfully, lice are species specific, so goat lice will not go on people and people lice will not go on anything other than people. Fly control is always a challenge, especially when it gets hot out. And my best advice is start early, start off, and be aggressive with fly traps and attractants to try and get them under control. Body condition scoring is how we assess kind of the weight of each animal and if they are healthy, obese, or underweight. So this is the best picture that I could find. It's focusing mostly on the hips and the rump area here. And generally I use this as well as the amount of padding over their ribs to decide if they're an appropriate body condition score. So we usually scale these on a scale of 1 to 9, with 1 being emaciated, 9 being severely obese, and 4.5 being perfect in the middle. So keeping in mind this body condition scoring is what will help decide who needs to be dewormed and how. So one of the biggest challenges that we have with goats right now is that their dewormers are available over the counter, which means they are used a lot and they are used inappropriately. So these worms that are exposed to these lower doses of medications are developing resistance to these medications. And our problem is we only have a limited number of options when it comes to deworming. So using that body condition scoring chart, look at your animals, decide who are the ones that are the thinnest, deworm those, or send in a fecal for those animals and deworm based on that fecal. So I know some horse owners say you need to deworm in the spring and the fall. We don't recommend that with goats just because this resistance is becoming a real problem. And again, I've seen goats as young as 6 months old perish to parasites, and it can be heartbreaking. So the FAMACHA score is copyrighted, so technically you don't get the little card unless you go through their class, but it's a way to generalize how anemic your animals are. So if you look at the lower eyelid, it's more accurate than looking at the gums of animals like we sometimes do with dogs and cats, but we can kind of grade that, and anything that's looking pale, pink, or pale needs to be addressed. Oh boy, goat reproduction, and this could be its own lecture here. So I'll just kind of hit the main parts and pieces. So goats are seasonally polyestrous, which means they cycle and come into heat multiple times in the fall. This is different than horses, which cycle multiple times in the spring, but goats' gestation period is much, much shorter than a horse. So goats are only pregnant for about 5 months versus horses that are closer to a year. So they breed in the fall, so their kids are born in the spring. We can diagnose pregnancy via ultrasound at 30 days. There are also blood tests that you can draw yourself and send into labs. I will warn you, the blood test can sometimes be a false positive, especially if the doe has lost the pregnancy and it's still in the early stages. Ultrasound is really nice because we can see the viability of the kids and see the heart rate. Multiples are very common. So twins in horses is a nightmare. Twins in goats is a daily occurrence. So this doe over here on the right, I think she was cooking 4 or something like that. She's got a lot of real estate in there. There's a higher rate of needing C-sections or cesarean sections in smaller breeds. So Nigerian dwarfs, which are absurdly popular, and those pygmy goats that we saw earlier, of course, they tend to have the largest litter sizes and the most complications. So usually goats are proficient mothers, so they'll take care of their kids, they'll nurse them appropriately. Sometimes if they have multiples, you have to keep track and make sure that everybody is nursing appropriately, because goat udders only have 2 teats or 2 spigots instead of cows that have 4. So sometimes the mothers won't allow that 3rd or 4th kid to get on there, especially if the other siblings are a little bit bigger. There's an option to do natural breeding, which is honestly the easiest way. Goats have been breeding by themselves for centuries, so they don't need our help. But artificial insemination is something that is becoming more popular, especially with meat and dairy goats. So that is something that some people, myself included, dabble in just to increase genetic diversity. And dear Lord, if you are not planning to breed your male goat, please castrate it. Male goats are vile creatures. I should have included a picture, but I didn't. They stink. They urinate on themselves to create the pheromones that make them attractive to the females. They will urinate on their legs and on their faces, and they will behave poorly. And in the fall, their perfume permeates everything. So if you are not planning to breed your animals, please castrate them. So, trigger warning, sorry, there's some blood on the slide. So, complicated deliveries. I'm not going to go into positions of the fetus and how to rotate legs and untangle kids and stuff like that. I'll just say, in general, if you have a doe that is pushing hard with no progress for 30 minutes, this is an emergency. And it always happens at like 5:30 on a Friday. That's what happened to this little doe. She had a very large single kid that could not be manipulated normally. So we brought him out the side door and he did just fine. And then at the end of that 150 days, when you're patiently waiting, this is what you hope to see. And my ultrasound video didn't work. Oh, RIP. That was going to be really good. I'm sorry, guys. So, newborn care and considerations. Kids should be removed from the birthing sac and have their nose cleared from the fluid as soon as possible. Wear gloves. Big asterisk here. There are a lot of diseases that can be spread from goats to humans, so make sure you protect yourself. Check these kids for cleft palates by sticking your finger in their mouth, and their umbilical cords need to be dipped in iodine or diluted iodine to keep safe from having umbilical cord infection. Keeping kids warm and dry is imperative because they will not nurse and they will not eat and digest properly if they're cold. So their internal body temperature should reach 100 degrees before attempting to feed them. And then the first milk that their mom produces is colostrum. It's very nutrient dense, has a ton of immune complexes in it. It is essential for lifelong health for these guys. So getting colostrum into these kids is vitally important as soon as they can nurse. If you are planning to dehorn or tattoo your kids, have that done within the first 2 weeks of birth. It makes the procedure a lot more simple and the recovery a lot faster than if you waited longer than that. So going from the beginning of life towards closer to the end of life, there are two main things that we worry about when we're talking about senior animals. The first is dental care. And if you've watched some of the other Saturday seminar series, you've gone over dentistry and horses. So thankfully, goats don't need as routine care, but they can definitely get hooks and points on their molars that affect their ability to grind. And their incisors on the bottom can get lost with age too, and that affects how well they can pick up and prehend their food. So we need to adjust some things and transition to feeds that have a smaller fiber size, so not as grassy and stemmy hay, something like beet pulp, which is a great source of fiber and energy, but a little bit easier to chew, or even chaff hay, which is kind of fermented hay in smaller chopped pieces, makes it a little bit easier for these older kids to eat. Osteoarthritis is something that we can see in older goats as well. So their ability to jump and change and walk normally can change with the inflammation in their joints. There are some oral joint supplements that we can use, but the problem is they're formulated for animals that have a stomach like ours, not the rumen like goats have. So the rumen does a good job of decimating the feed that goes in it, and it decimates the medications we give as well, so they're not as absorbed as effectively. I have used injectable Adequan, which is a horse and a dog product, and I've seen some pretty decent results to that. If it is severe enough, we can use meloxicam, that anti-inflammatory, But like I said, the absorption is a little variable for that. And if we use it long term, just like in other animals, we have potential risk for GI ulceration and impairment of kidney function if it's given long term. But if for some reason we need to give an oral medication, you can give them in a fig Newton. They don't usually complain when it comes to fig Newtons. Marshmallows are also good alternatives, but there's a lot more sugar in those. So when it comes to end-of-life care, and this can be a challenging topic to discuss, but an important topic to discuss, there are two main considerations to have, or two main ways that we can offer humane euthanasia for these animals. The first is traditional euthanasia solution. So this is what is done for dogs and cats and small animal. It does require a veterinarian, so this is not something that you can have at home to do yourself. It's an overdose of an anesthetic drug, so it's not going to hurt. It's going to affect the sleep centers in the brain. It's going to turn down the heart rate, and that is the method of how they pass away. It's nothing averse or jolting or anything like that. The problem is it does need to be given in the vein, and that can be difficult if the animal is very sick and anemic and their blood pressure is not good, or in feral animals. So an example would be if a goat has a broken leg or something like that and they're not down and sick, but you can't touch them, that can be a very difficult option. The biggest challenge that we have is if we use this euthanasia solution on them, their body needs to be cremated or buried at least 6 foot deep. And this is because scavenging animals, if they eat that animal's carcass that has the euthanasia solution in it, those animals can ingest enough of the solution to die too. So I've heard of veterinarians losing their license and getting sued for euthanizing cattle with this drug. And then there was an issue with bald eagles and wolves eating the body and then dying after that. So this is a very big and important consideration. The second option for humane euthanasia, and this has been determined to be humane if done appropriately, is a gunshot or a captive bolt, which is kind of a retained firearm. So the actual shooting component never leaves the barrel, it returns right back to it. So there is some technical skill that goes into this because goats have such large frontal sinuses because they headbutt. You can't shoot in the same place that you would other animals. So there is some knowledge that goes along with that. Because their bones and their skull, especially that frontal sinus, are so thick, ricochet off the bone is possible. So there is some potential for human injury there too. It is a less expensive option. So especially when you're talking about cremation costs and costs of drugs involved, typical euthanasia solution will be a little bit more than a bullet necessarily. It can be faster for emergencies. So if you have a goat that's down or if it has a broken leg and if it's something that can't wait and we know that this is the option for it, it could be a little bit faster. But for larger animals, you do need larger caliber firearms. So 22s for smaller kids and lambs, but larger caliber for larger animals. And I apologize if this image is abrasive to anyone, but because their frontal sinuses are so large, when you do use a firearm to euthanize an animal humanely, you need to shoot from the back too. So, sorry to end on kind of a depressing note there, but here are some amazing resources when it comes to dairy goat education and knowledge. The first is the American Association of Small Ruminant Practitioners. This is a group of veterinarians that have dedicated themselves to serving clients that own these animals. It also covers things like llamas, alpacas, and sheep, as well as domesticated deer. And one of the nicest things that they have is the Find a Vet feature on their page. So it's becoming increasingly difficult to find veterinarians that treat small ruminants like goats. And, you know, honestly, most cattle practitioners can't be bothered to treat them differently than small cows, and they are not small cows. So they do deserve some individuals that have dedicated themselves to learning more about them. So if you're in an area or you don't know the closest veterinarian, this might be a good option. The American Dairy Goat Association and American Goat Society have really great information about kind of the popularity of goats and the uses of goats in the dairy realm. The American Goat Society also has a gestation calculator on there too. So if you put the date that the doe was exposed to the buck, it'll give you an estimated due date. University of Maryland and Washington State Extension offices have a ton of information on common diseases and testing. And then if worse comes to worse, there's the Goat Vet Corner page on Facebook. So only veterinarians are allowed to comment on cases and pictures that are posted there. It is only a volunteer group, so there's no guarantee that your question will be answered, but it is a great resource to exhaust, especially if you're unable to find a practitioner to come out to your farm. And that is the end for me. So it's a ton of information. I hope I covered everything adequately, and I'm sure there will be questions. So if you want to go ahead and put those in the chat, then I will be happy to go over those at this time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Emma. We did have someone ask what your personal favorite breed of goat is.
Oh gosh, I'm an alpine girl. So of the dairy goats, you know, the breeds all have their own quirks, that's for sure. Alpines tend to be more independent. They tend to be more dominant. They're very level producers. And, you know, thinking creatively, there's not a color standard for them. So they can be almost any color combination. And that kind of gives a little bit of variety, especially when the kids are born. So alpines are my favorite, even though they can be bullies at times. I'll admit that.
Excellent. Does anyone else have any questions? Please feel free to unmute yourself and ask them. Okay, I guess I do have a couple. So how would you be able to age a goat if you were either looking to adopt a goat, or at HAHS, we have gotten 2 goats in from animal control agencies, and we're, you know, for horses, you can look at their teeth. For goats, how would you age them?
Yeah. So great question. And we also look at the teeth for goats as well. So they don't have the same wearing pattern as horses do, but the way that they grow in their adult teeth is very systematic. So they have all of their deciduous or baby teeth up until they're a year old, and they start to lose their incisors, their little bottom incisors from the middle going out. So they've got 4 sets of 2 incisors. So they'll lose the first pair when they're 1, the second pair when they're 2, 3, and 4. Beyond that, it becomes a little bit more challenging. You kind of have to look at their overall thrift. And then I saw a goat a couple weeks ago that they brought in that said, oh, he's 2 years old. And I opened his mouth and he was missing all but 1 tooth. So that guy was definitely ancient. So once you kind of get over the 5-year range, up until they get closer to 10 or 12, there's a little bit of guesswork that goes into that.
Okay, we have another question. When you have too many kids, especially males, what options do we have for rehoming? Petting zoos, family pets and companions, are there resources for that type of thing?
So this is definitely a consideration to have before you decide to breed in the first place, is what are you going to do with your extra kids? So this is especially a challenge in the dairy realm because there's not a ton of kind of usefulness for these male animals that aren't good enough to be breeding quality, but don't have a place in the dairy production system. So that's when we start to look for alternatives. So I know personally, I'm a bad farmer. I can't eat my own animals, and I don't have any desire to. So I have a couple that I've rehomed to petting zoos. I have a couple that have gone to family farms. I have some that have gone up to a brush clearing company up in Wisconsin that's starting that up. But I'd say the majority of times, especially for dairy animals, their fate is to enter into the food chain. And I think that is something that, if done well, is not inhumane, but it's definitely a consideration that you have is, where are these animals going to end up if you're breeding and bringing them into the world?
Okay, and a follow-up question to that is, how do you decide which ones to keep? So what, I guess, would you look for in something you'd like to breed again?
Yeah. So it kind of depends on your goal. So if it's just for a pet and a companion, then I would choose the kids that are socialized the best. So those animals are going to be more interactive. They're going to be easier to catch and handle and medicate. If you're working and breeding in a production system, you're going to want to look at the parentage, the registries, and kind of the animals that back that animal. So kind of going off on a tangent, I'm most familiar with the American Dairy Goat Association, so I'll speak to that. But when they're judged and shown, there's a scorecard that they're judged against. And that is the ideal anatomy that will support a long and productive lifespan. So things like udder size, things like udder support, strength of feet and legs and pasterns, and how the animal is built. They're looking for animals that are most ideal, that will hold up over years and multiple lactations. So if you have
today?
if you have animals that are consistent in their lineage and are improving upon the animals that you have, those are animals that you want to keep in your breeding program to continue to improve. You know, everyone's building and breeding to get the perfect goat, and that takes years and time. So this is definitely a conversation for if you want to stop by the fair and chat, because we could have a whole hour-long conversation about pedigrees and choices and which things to prioritize over the others. But essentially, if the animal isn't better than its parent, I wouldn't keep it, especially if it's a male goat, because a male goat is half your herd. You breed that animal to everything. And if it's not going to improve the things that you know are faults and defects in your animals, then why would you continue pursuing that lineage?
Wonderful. Thank you. And just to go back to the question about rehoming males that you choose not to breed. So could you give us just a rough estimate of what it costs to neuter a male goat?
Yeah, so depending on the comfort level of the owner, this can be done by the producer themselves. So one method of castration is banding. So at farm store supplies, you can get a tool called an emasculator. It opens up a really thick rubber band that you flip their testicles through. And when that rubber band is closed, it cuts off circulation to the testicles. Nerves are damaged within the first hour or so it's not painful after that. But over time, because of the loss of blood supply, those testicles will shrivel and fall off. That is what a lot of producers elect because it doesn't involve a veterinarian. If you do involve a vet, I know up until 2 months old, it's a much less invasive procedure because goats especially, but other ruminants, are very well endowed and their testicles grow very large, very fast. So with a little bit of injectable sedation after they're 2 months old, that might be needed to be able to castrate them. And it's very similar to how we castrate dogs. But I'd say if you're looking for minimally invasive, I would do the banding younger than 2 months. There's been some discussion about whether or not banding them and castrating them younger affects the diameter of their urethra, because urinary obstruction is such a big problem. I know some individuals are proponents of waiting until they're 4 months old to castrate, but by that time, they're much too big for the bands to work effectively and humanely. So then we're talking about sedation and other surgical options, and sometimes that can be cost prohibitive, especially for people with larger production systems. So my general recommendation is, if we are going to neuter and you want to do it yourself, do it less than 2 months old. And then as far as avenues for rehoming, I've actually had a lot of good luck on Facebook. So in Midwestern farming groups or goat-specific groups, there are some people that look on there for getting animals for petting zoos and things like that. So that's where I would start. Craigslist is another option too. And then, making sure you do your part to investigate who you're potentially sending your animals home with, just so you can ensure that they're going to be taken care of appropriately. And I will say, if you purchase animals, even if they are castrated males that aren't good enough to be kept in breeding stock, they have been well bred and thoughtfully bred, and those breeders are resources for you as well when it comes to caring for them down the road. So I still have owners that I've sold animals to years ago that reach out every once in a while with questions, and I'm more than happy to answer, because as a responsible producer, I feel some type of responsibility to make sure that I'm continuing to be a resource for these individuals that have purchased animals from me.
Wonderful. That's always really nice to hear that producers care about their animals throughout their lives and making sure that they have a happy home and are healthy. One follow-up question again is, what is the easiest breed to start young children with? Does it matter? And what other animals can goats live happily with, such as cows, donkeys, farm dogs, horses? I'm assuming alpacas and pigs are in there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I will say the most popular breeds that we have right now are the miniature breeds. So whether that's the Nigerian dwarf, which is a miniature dairy goat, or breeds like pygmy goats, people love small things. So they love these tiny breeds. I will say they're not always the greatest for kids, though, especially in the show ring. When I see young kids leading around these little Nigerians in the ring, the problem is their center of gravity is so low that they take these kids for a ride. So I'll say any breed is appropriate as long as they're socialized correctly. And I think sometimes the bigger ones can be gentle giants, but you might have some size constraints there. Goats can be housed with other ruminants like sheep. There is some talk about whether or not you can get a geep if you breed a goat and a sheep, so I wouldn't keep intact animals of both species together. But if you've got castrated males or if you've got all females, that could be just fine. They can be kept with horses. They can be really good companion animals for horses, but I do know that sometimes goats like to chew on horse tails, so sometimes that can be an issue. So if you show and you really want them to have that really nice full tail, I wouldn't keep them with a goat, because that can be kind of frustrating to run into. Okay, and then it looks like we have a question in the chat. So, issues with siblings breeding, and this is partially a joke but partially true. If you breed two closely related animals and it works, it's called line breeding. If you breed two closely related animals and it doesn't work, it's called inbreeding. So full siblings would be a little close for me. I don't think you'll have a goat kid that pops out with like 5 legs or anything like that. I would do what you've already done and not repeat it. And this is especially important to be aware of because goats can be reproductively mature at 5 months old. So it's important to keep an eye on these small animals because goats also, well, any animal, doesn't have that familial sense of, this is my sister, I will not breed her. Male animals are voracious breeders, and they will breed anything. So pregnancy testing, you can ultrasound as soon as 30 days. Honestly, 40 to 50 days after exposure is usually easier, but I don't think you'll get a two-headed goat or anything from this exposure.
That is good to hear. Going back to the CAE and CL, and I apologize if I missed it. So the CAE is a virus. Is the CL a virus, a bacteria?
I think that's also a virus as well.
Okay.
Yep, and I think the biggest pearl is that the infectious material is that caseous and chunky and mushy white stuff that becomes the lymph node. And I don't know if we've looked into the effect that the animal has after losing those lymph nodes to this disease, but my guess is that it's not impactful enough to be important. So another big thing with goats is that because they are not a large production animal in the United States and their quote unquote value as production animals isn't the same as others, there is not a ton of research that is done on these animals, and the amount of medications and drugs that we have for on-label use for goats is very limited. So there's still a lot left to discover, and I think as these guys rise in popularity and as these questions are being asked, we'll have more ammunition and more funding for the research that needs to be done. But a lot of our dosing and testing and things like this is kind of guesswork because there's just not the money in the research right now. And it's frustrating to goat owners and to veterinarians because it's just not there for us. So I think with time this will improve. But for now, we're kind of left with what we're left with, and we just kind of do the best we can.
Absolutely. So how are those two viruses contracted in the first place? Does a goat carrying the virus come into the herd? Is this something that is passed through transmission from people or other animals?
Yeah, so the CL, the abscess one, it's exposure to that infectious material from another animal or on other surfaces or fomites that had that kind of purulent infected material on it. So it's exposure through the nose, through the mouth, or another open wound. For that one, there's not as much vertical passing and transmission, so from mom to baby, but just when those abscesses are open and draining, those lesions need to come in contact with other animals. So when you've got an open lesion, housing them separately and keeping them clean and throwing all that infectious material well away from other animals is important to stop the spread. CAE is a little bit more complicated. So one of the biggest forms of transmission we see is that vertical transmission from mom to baby through the milk. But the scary and frustrating thing for producers is that can be spread through any bodily fluid. So animals sneezing on each other, stepping in milk, producers that use needles from one animal into the next animal to try and save 20 cents on a needle are potentially exposing other animals too. And it can be really hard to get this disease out of a herd once it's present because you need to rehome and cull and cut back and test a lot because the incubation period for CAE can be 2 to 3 months. So if you have a positive animal that you cull and rehome, you have to retest everyone 2 to 3 months after and kind of continue that cycle while being diligent about pasteurizing milk for the kids so that you're not continuing to spread it.
Thank you so much for that. And then I just have a personal question. Goat eyes, it looks like they have horizontal pupils. Is that accurate?
Yeah, so they do. They have abnormally shaped pupils, and their eyes are positioned on our heads similarly to horses to try and allow for 360 vision. But
Okay.
actually, one of the only other animals on the world that has the same shaped pupils as goats is a squid. So all of that is to allow for light to make it into the eye to be able to see far distances in dim lighting. So they are a prey species, so that adaptation is meant to keep them safe. But I think that's also why, and I didn't want to touch on this because religion is always a weird topic, but I think that's partially why goats are kind of seen as demonic sometimes, because they do have abnormal eyes that can be very jolting if you're not expecting it. In the really bright light, when those pupils get really small, it's like, oh my gosh, what's going on there? But totally normal and adaptation they have to keep themselves safe.
Interesting. Okay. Does anyone else have any other questions for Dr. Emma today? Okay, Dr. Emma, we do have one sort of traditional question that we ask all of our speakers here on the HAHS seminar series. What was your favorite book when you were a child? It could be about goats, it could be about other animals, but we always like to see sort of what inspired our speakers to pursue their lifelong passion with animals.
Oh gosh, that's a hard one. But I think my favorite was probably Click Clack Moo, because it involves the farm animals and I really like rhyming.
Nice. That is fun. Thank you. Okay. I
Thank you
believe,
so much for having me. I was super excited to speak, and I hope the lack of questions is due to a lot of information and not because I put everyone to sleep.
no, not at all. We had a steady stream of questions coming into me, which I think I covered them all. And we will definitely have to have you back if any of our attendees today have specific topics that they would like Dr. Emma to cover in the future. As long as she's willing to come back, we would love to have her. So please either post them in the chat before you leave today or on the Facebook event. We will post the link to this webinar in that event when we get it processed and up. And the slide that is up right now is Dr. Emma's contact information. We'll post that in the event as well. And just a quick reminder, next month on August 13th, we will be talking about equine gastric ulcer syndrome with Dr. Catherine Golden from Northern Lakes Equine Practice. It's estimated that anywhere between 50 and 90% of horses may suffer from some level of gastric ulcers. And Dr. Golden has a wonderful presentation. We hope you'll join us, and that event with the registration link is live in our Facebook page right now. Dr. Emma, thank you again so much for being with us today, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you guys as well, and I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend. Be sure to stop by the fairs and come and say hi.
Absolutely, and we'll grab that slide from you and put it in our event as well so everyone knows the dates. Thank you everyone for joining us. Get out there, enjoy a beautiful, well, here in Northern Illinois, it's a beautiful sunny day. We hope it's a beautiful day where you are as well. Thank you for joining us.